Great to see you all. So we're starting today. Phaik, Yeong and I are just going to offer some reflections, possibly some new questions that have arisen to us as a result of yesterday's discussions. Just briefly to introduce myself as well, my name's Anna Chiumento and I'm a member of the steering committee for the GFBR. So, some reflections from yesterday. What really excited me about this particular topic and the possibilities for our discussions were the options for alternative futures. And this is the first point that I want to just reflect on and remind us around as we move into the second day. So Cesar yesterday morning really emphasized ideas of moving past present conditions to question some of the current systems. And in groups and individual reflections, my plea is to keep a different world vision in our sights. What are or is the model of research collaboration that we ought to be aiming for? Even this in itself as a question, I feel, comes across as quite limited. Do we need to think in terms of models, or what happens, as was highlighted yesterday by Devaki, if we shift our gaze, if we think about island hopping? How does that help us to rethink some of the considerations? And here I am in particular reminded of how partnerships themselves are not abstracted. They are embedded in multiple systems, each with their own internal logics of what they are seeking to achieve. So, for example, partnerships are often embedded within legal discourses and practices of contracts and of governance. How do these pre-structure some of that space for moral action? Is it possible to achieve equity when neoliberal norms of income generation or hierarchical accountability structures actually underpin and undergird those relationships? And are there particular features of partnerships that we have perhaps been part of that are within this type of model and outside of that type of model, so those bounded by the contractual and governance structures and those that do not rely on those, that might point to morally relevant considerations that we ought to be reflecting on and thinking through? And this draws on Marlin's insights into the paradigm shifts that history offers us in how global health has been viewed, approached, and practiced. Given current geopolitical circumstances, and we have had many allusions to changed funding, landscapes in particular, what paradigm shifts do we in the room, shaped and framed by ethical values and practices, want to be promoting? And that brings me to my second point, which is the implicit boundaries that I felt we have kind of drawn around discussing the scope of what a partnership is. How power in particular manifests in those motivations and interests of each partner. As Mike was reflecting yesterday, when he did a very nice sum up of yesterday, this does generate particular types of wicked problems. And I guess I'm contending that these could act as springboards, again, for reimagining where we go from here. Listening yesterday, I heard a lot of reflections on a particular type of partnership model. So the kind of research consortium type model driven by academic research institutions with university actors and involving kind of the securing of competitive international funding, generally from global north sources. But what of those other actors in this space? So the role of funders was mentioned both in plenary and in the discussion groups, and they were recognized as holding particular types of power that could help us to reimagine how partnerships might be structured. So there were examples of genomics research, for example, and funding calls that promoted African PIs rather than international-led studies, and how that perhaps helps to think about shifting power. There was also particular discussions around the role of funders in promoting accountability, although I felt that, again, I was struggling sort of conceptually with what exactly was going on there. Who are they holding accountable and for what? Often ideas of funder accountability mechanisms translate into what Strathan termed audit cultures that reinscribe particular types of neoliberal practices. Is this the limit of our moral horizon for what funders could be offering in this space, for example? Local communities were also prominent in our discussions yesterday, and as Mike reflected, they expanded some of the perceptions of who partners are and align very much with wider moves towards co-constructive research practices and paradigms, or at minimum kind of community engagement and involvement. We also had brief mentions of international organizations, be it the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, and their efforts to promote or shape partnerships in particular types of ways in response to particular circumstances and motivated by particular agendas. So again, kind of what are the roles in this space, and to what extent do we need to remain critical of their interests, their compositions in promoting certain types of partnership agendas? Actors that I didn't hear mentioned and whom I think it would be remiss not to recognize are more of the private entities working in the research space. So pharmaceutical companies or private tech companies, for example, those commercial bodies who also conduct research. And these actors often are motivated in ways other than London's view of the common good. Their role in the research space is growing, so how do we speak to these actors when we are thinking about reimagining the ethics of research partnerships? Does this shift the balance of the values that need to be prioritized? Does the model that was shared yesterday around efficiency, benefit maximization, and equity, does this need to be reconsidered in these types of partnerships? How are those being balanced? For example, do commercial interests necessarily perhaps preclude achieving equity in the way that you may be able to do in other types of partnerships? And can the power of these research actors be exercised in ways that we would consider morally commendable and that we would want to promote as an alternative vision for partnerships? Basically, I'm asking, is this an example of our imperfect world? And what do these conditions of imperfections mean for our moral visions? Another one only mentioned briefly was the role of particularly Global South governments. I was encouraged by Stella's discussion of advocacy within the Ugandan context and how that had led to the establishment of seed funding within the country. Whilst relative to sums spent on research, this may be small, but it also signals an important potential political shift in reshaping local research environments in particular. And what of the other types of relationships that could potentially be forged in this particular moment in history? In our breakout group, for example, we've been trying to really critically consider why it is that capacity building is assumed to be unidirectional. How do we challenge those epistemic hierarchies, colonial histories that lead to those assumptions that in order to gain skills, knowledge must come from certain types of people embedded in certain types of institutional environments? How are we reproducing epistemic and colonial hierarchies in these choices? And that brings me to my third and final reflection, which is on whose voices we are hearing. There is an inherent limitation to these types of meetings where English is our default language in common. We also have a process for who ends up in this room, who ends up on this stage, which unavoidably limit us in particular types of ways. So going back to the earlier point of expanding the scope of actors and frequent critiques of kind of speaking for, I can't help but ask myself whether we are rehearsing some of the same and how we encourage ourselves to move beyond that. To borrow from Bell Hooks' idea of embracing thinking from the margins, what would a partnership look like that started from the vision of those on the margins? So that started from those that research is aiming to benefit, or that was being driven by the researchers on the ground envisaging how a partnership should be structured and what it should be delivering in terms of benefits. So what moral salient features, both virtues and pitfalls, might be identified through that sort of approach that would help us to shift the gaze, again, reimagining in different ways? And we did hear some reflections on some of this yesterday around recognizing the moral harms for researchers and frontline staff. And I think they maybe offer us some purchase for thinking about what are the alternative futures. Those were some of my reflections, or perhaps more provocations, and I hope that they're helpful as we regather our thoughts and move into a second day of presentations. I'm going to hand over to Phaik Yeong, who's going to offer some of her reflections as well.
Thank you, Anna. Right, everyone. Hi, good morning. Hi, I'm Phaik Yeong. I'm from the Mahidol Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit. I'm based in Thailand. I am Malaysian, though. So Anna has talked about partnerships, so focusing on the partnerships, primarily on the partnerships part of the title of our GFBR. For me, I'm going to focus more on the equity part of the title of our conference. So yesterday, I heard the term equity, equality, ethics throughout yesterday. I can't help but wonder, what are we really after? Are we after equitable partnership? Are we after equal partnership? Or are we after ethical partnership? And Luz asked, is this utopia? So equity differs from equality, we know that. Equality involves treating everyone the same, equal respect. Equity recognizes that individuals face different circumstances and structural barriers, and therefore, equity means treating people differently sometimes when appropriate. And ethical means doing the right thing. So a few things I heard yesterday from various people that helped my understanding. We need equity to achieve equal partnerships, according to Caesar. And what I heard in my group, equal partnership means each partner being heard, being able to contribute meaningfully and contribute to decision making, be it early career researchers or field workers. And equality in partnership also means treating each partner with equal respect, said Mike. So health research. This was inspired by Carla's talk. Carla said, health research is a morally loaded enterprise. It's different from varnish research. Words of wisdom from Carla Science. As health researchers or bioethicists working in this space, our aim is to improve health of people. We also talked about global health yesterday. So global health as opposed to health. So global health, and some scholars define global health as health research that aims to advance health equity. That means focusing on the needs of the most disadvantaged populations, the poorest of the poor. Our aim is to advance health equity. We talked about equity in teams. So in my group yesterday, we talked about what does it mean to be a responsible partner in a health research group. Felista said, being responsible means not losing sight of the goal of a research study. The example was, if the goal is to advance malaria treatment, we keep our eye on that prize. We talk primarily about equity in teams and collaborations, and we focus primarily on high income setting versus low income setting, or whatever term that we use, majority versus minority world. But less so on women or men versus women, English speakers versus non-English speakers, senior versus junior researchers, and among disciplines. Chelsea touched upon some of these issues in her talk about equity in authorships. But these are important things to consider as well, not only about which geographical region or globe we come from. And finally, I leave you with this question. Should health equity in teams and partnerships be a means to an end, the end being advancing health equity, or is it a means in itself? That's all from me, thank you. Have a good day. Right, Anna? I think we're done.